Hi, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Dissidents and Dictators, the flagship podcast from the Human Rights Foundation. My name is Elisha Maldonado, sitting alongside my co-host, Mr. Casey Michelle. With the second anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine coming up this weekend, we have a guest here to talk about the stakes and ongoing developments. Her name is Lisa Yasko, and she's a member of Ukraine's parliament, the Committee on Foreign Affairs and Interparliamentary Cooperation, and the Ukrainian delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. She's also the founder of Yellow Blue Strategy, an NGO working to make Ukraine creative, safe, and sustainable. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for your invitation to speak.
How are you? You're based in Kyiv at the moment, correct?
Yeah, I'm in Kyiv. I just came back from Munich Security Conference, and I had a more than 24-hour trip on the way back home.
Well, I'd love to talk about that, but can you give us the feeling of what the mood is like in Kyiv at the moment with the anniversary a couple days away?
Well, this week is a very dramatic week for our recent history, because not only the full-scale war has started 2 years ago, but also 10 years ago there was very tragic days of our revolution of dignity when protesters were killed. We call these 100 people, in fact more than 100 people, heavenly 100 heroes. They were killed because they were fighting for the freedom, for European choice of Ukraine. And this week is very, very sad and full of memories, full of thoughts on things that we used to believe in and didn't know what the world could bring to us in the next years. At that time, I think 10 years ago, we were quite naive. Also 2 years ago, with the full-scale invasion, of course, no one could ever imagine anything similar that this terrible war could do to our lives.
Lisa, I think it's great that you bring up the 10-year anniversary, because I think a lot of folks, especially those like us in the United States, maybe don't remember, maybe forget that this invasion did not begin 2 years ago, even though we have obviously the 2-year anniversary of the expanded invasion, but it began 10 years ago with Russian troops going into Crimea and obviously supporting entities and elements in part of eastern Ukraine as well. I'm wondering, Lisa, if you could take us back, because again, we were all so much younger 10 years ago, and we have all learned so much over the last 10 years. Where were you 10 years ago, in February, in March, in the success of Euromaidan, and then when we first began seeing Russian troops on Ukrainian territory? Were you in Kyiv at the time? Were you a student at the time? Were you working?
Yeah, I was a student and I was working, and in fact, I was at the barricades of Euromaidan and playing the piano between the police and protesters. It was a very hard period for me, because I also was finishing my master degree, and a part of my master degree was an exchange program that I did in Moscow. So, in fact, I was... last time I was in Russia, it was in 2014. But already at that time, I remember how in the Russian airports, the Russian guards and border guards would ask me the questions, security questions. There was a lot of pressure. There was a lot of very bad attitude, lots of aggression also already in the air and in place in 2013 in Russia towards Ukraine. And then, it was just very dramatic moments, the February and January 2014, when thousands of people were at demonstrations in Ukraine, because we wanted freedom, and we still want freedom. But the 10 years have passed, and unfortunately we still have the same fight, but this fight became even bigger now.
I remember there is a famous video on YouTube of you playing piano during Euromaidan, which we can link to in the show notes. Lisa, do you still play piano? Is this still something you find time for?
It's actually quite a sensitive question to me, because music was always for me the voice of freedom, the voice of something that I was using to tell some of the things I believed in. Mm-hmm. And after Euromaidan, I stopped doing it, in fact. And I only very rarely I come back to it. But recently I decided that I have to go back to some of my music connection, because simply it's not only a way to make a statement, but also it's a healing. And it's very important connection to arts that can help you in very hard times that most of us go through, including myself. I need to find some, creative energy from somewhere. And I hope that the piano that is currently in my apartment will help me to do that.
Hopefully, absolutely. Well, let's bring things back to where they are this year, right now, Lisa. The conversations that are taking place in Kyiv, the conversation you are having with colleagues as well as with partners in places like certainly Munich, but also Brussels, and I'm sure you're following developments in Washington as well. A lot of our listeners, again, Lisa, are based in the West, based in places like the U.S. or certainly parts of Western and Central Europe. Obviously, we see the conversations, we see the debates about policy continue moving forward. I'm wondering from your perspective, from your vantage point, what do you think is being overlooked? What do you think is being forgotten? What do you think is being ignored in some of these conversations as it regards developments and certainly support for Ukraine and, again, the Ukrainians literally on the front lines of this fight for freedom?
I always try to repeat that it's not only our fight. It's not the Ukrainian fight for freedom. It's actually much bigger fight for the new international security order, for the new future system of international law that should be functional. So it's bigger than just our fight. But one thing that really disappoints me now, especially when I go to such places as Munich Security Conference and I have an opportunity to speak to many head of the states and listen to many of statements like publicly, informally and formally. I feel like the world in general, the West, already accepted the fact that we are going through very hard times and that there will be war maybe even longer and bigger in the rest of the world, and there will be more conflicts and wars in the war. And I even asked my question to some of this during this conversation. So why actually we accept it as by default? Why don't we want to prevent it from happening? And I'm not satisfied with the answers that I hear. It feels like we go through very turbulent, very existential political time in different countries. And we forget that literally for tomorrow, you need to plan yesterday and before yesterday. And I'm very scared because of many elections that are going to take place this year, including the US. And it's not about personalities. It's more about that many things become a part of populistic battles that is not helpful for things that our societies, our world needs to have now.
I mean, look, Lisa, you're exactly right. It's not about the personalities. These are broader trends. These are broader trajectories that certainly some of these personalities are picking up on. But I want to go back to what you said earlier, that yes, of course, the fight is on Ukrainian territory. And of course, it is the Ukrainians that are fighting and dying day in and day out for Ukrainian freedom, Ukrainian sovereignty. But at the end of the day, it's not just the fight for Kyiv's sovereignty. I think a lot of folks have forgotten that this is a fight for all of us, for global security, for democracy as we know it, as we understand it. And frankly, the Ukrainians have been doing this for a decade now. They have been the model. They've been the go-to for folks who want to be inspired, who want to look at even the costs, what it means to be on the front lines of this fight against dictatorship. And unfortunately, far too many continue to forget that or overlook that, even while the support that the Ukrainians need, they continue to need the kind of support, because this is not going to end tomorrow. It's not going to end even next week. It has to continue moving forward.
Yes, exactly. And, I'm very worried in general. You ask me, how do I feel these days? I'm more worried than I was a year ago or 2 years ago. Exactly because of the reasons you mentioned. There is too much uncertainty in the world. There is to less visible leadership, political leadership, that would be building, very wise decisions.
Well, let's turn maybe to some more optimistic news. Obviously, there's plenty of reason for concern. There's plenty of reason for pessimism. But maybe let's turn to a little bit of optimism, both on the ground, but also more broadly. I'm wondering, Lisa, I mean, look, we've seen obviously successes in terms of Ukraine's Black Sea operations. It's been an incredible success. I think a lot of folks still aren't paying attention to necessarily. We did see the European Union's aid package come through, 50 billion, just a few weeks ago, and still potentially another aid package out of Washington. Are there elements either in Ukraine or more broadly that do give you the kind of optimism that you can look to, you can hold to, Lisa, as we move, further into 2024?
Yes, and I can share with you that, for instance, when I hear statements from certain countries, and I know about the real actions, for instance, as Norway and Scandinavian countries are doing, that they delivered lots of military aid to Ukraine, lots of humanitarian aid, and it's very consistent assistance and support now. And I see when Sweden and Finland joined NATO, I believe that it's incredibly important existentially. I mean, if such countries make such a decision, it means that they understand that they want to have a future in peace, and they are ready to even change their own position. And I think it's very positive. I also find, in fact, in Munich Security Conference, I had an opportunity to speak with some congressmen from US, and some of them were even from criticized currently groups from Republican party. And from what I've heard in majority of the conversation is that we have support from both parties. It's only the problem is internal battles that unfortunately are happening inside US. But I really hope that still the strategic things will even if they are postponed, they will still make it happen. I mean, Ukrainian aid and not only. So these things give me a hope. I also think that 2 years ago, the humanity woke up. I mean, international, I would say, international scene of people just opening their hearts and homes and minds to those who are in need. I mean, Ukrainians at that time, that's very, very big. And I know that many decisions were made after that on economy, on social areas, and it requires rethinking your own state strategies, policy strategies. And I know that it's happening in many countries, but I'm not happy with the pace of it, with the speed of it. But still, it's quite optimistic, and I think it's worth mentioning.
What are the next steps for Ukrainians as, it just time keeps marching forward and the fight continues, but...
Well, because of the things I just said, that we understand that the world is going through hell sometimes, we have learned to understand that we have to rely on ourselves, and we ask for support in the form of weapons and different kinds of assistance. But we are trying to build our own production, military production, to sustain our economy. We try to find out solutions that are needed for our people, and of course we struggle with many questions. But we are moving. Well, our next steps are all about defense of our own land, of our lives. Unfortunately, it's the same as the main goal was also 2 years ago.
I was going to ask, Lisa, in that end, what are the main topics of conversation taking place among you and your colleagues in Kyiv right now? Is it pertaining to strategy on the ground? Is it pertaining to building up new partnerships elsewhere? Is it pertaining to domestic economic reform? Is it pertaining to domestic democratic reform? What are kind of the top of mind conversations you are having with your colleagues right now? Here we are in February of 2024.
Well, of course, our attention goes to the forefront, and unfortunately, we have situation when Avdiivka was taken by Russians, and they managed to get it for one very simple reason: we didn't have enough weapon.
Yeah.
And so that's other topic that we discuss all the time. Of course, is international aid, and it's very sad because we are dependent on international aid of ammunition, of artillery, and different kinds of weapons. And this is what we're talking. I think this is the most crucial topics. And of course, the third one is how to defend Ukraine in general, and who is going to continue doing it, because many people are getting killed, and it's very hard, and it's very heartbreaking to see how many families are broken.
And you just got back, as you mentioned a moment ago, from Munich for the Munich Security Forum, Security Conference.
That's true.
Were there conversations there that surprised you in any way? Obviously, you follow this news day in and day out. You're often making the news day in and day out. Were there conversations or even representatives that were also in attendance that surprised you in any way?
Well, I think the main surprise comes from the fact that I saw that many people have took this war by just, not trying to do something more than just accepting it. So it feels like there is less conversation on what do we need to stop the war and to defend Ukraine. It's more about how do we make sure that we sustain that there is some justice and that Ukraine wins. And don't get me wrong here. What I mean by that, it feels like there is not enough strategic understanding on what needs to be done to prevent future wars. And it feels like we are just waiting for different things to happen, but we have also to prepare also what happens after them,
In light of, what are the things we can do to end this war? What do you make of some of the calls for Ukraine to make concessions to Moscow in order to, quote, hasten the end of it? I can imagine what Ukrainians' attitude is to that, but can you speak on it?
Yeah, and I will also ask you not to ask such questions because our president, for instance, said that when someone again and again asks him when the war will be over, when Ukraine will start negotiating for peace, President Zelensky said, look, but it's the wrong question. You should be asking question why we still have Russian aggression, why we still have the war, what can we do to stop the war? But look, they took millions of our lives and homes. They started this war to kill us in every possible way. It's not the moment when you negotiate, and it has been happening for years, and we just want to make the end to this terrible aggression that Russia is doing to us and also to the rest of the world by undermining also stabilities of other nations.
And of course, if there's one lesson from European security over the last century, it is that giving territory, giving peoples to dictators that are on the march does not satisfy them. They will always come back for more, as of course Putin has said time and time and time again about his views on Ukraine, his views on Ukrainians, and his views on Russia's, as he sees it, rightful place in the broader European security architecture itself. Lisa, I know we only have a few minutes with you remaining. I wanted to pull back maybe just a little bit and look at the kind of the broader realities, the broader implications of the fight in Ukraine, which again, I think a lot of people unfortunately have forgotten now that this expanded invasion is obviously 2 years old, as well as the invasion overall is now 10 years old. I mentioned earlier that the Ukrainians are on the front lines for the fight for freedom. I would love to hear your perspective on this. And again, how it is that the Ukrainians themselves are the ones that are fighting and dying not only for Ukrainian safety and sovereignty, but for democracy as we know it, to say nothing of global security in and of itself.
It's absolutely ideological, but also values conflict, war, because when the West proclaims that we want to defend democracy and human rights, then we have to have all the tools to do that. So if someone undermines it, then these people need or nations or countries or leaders need to be sanctioned if they don't respect territorial integrity, if they don't respect democracies, if they don't respect human rights. But it looks like it's very often only on paper, and we have to develop real tools in the forms of international organizations, in the forms of cooperation within NATO or any kind of security cooperation. It's not only hard power, but it's also soft power. We need to have education, and not only in place that will be explaining this, because it looks like we understand certain things, but we don't have tools and understanding how to protect that, just because someone seems to be stronger to impose aggression on us. So we need to work on how do we make sure that we are strong enough in the values of democracy that we believe in.
Well, Lisa, this has been a wonderful conversation, and we cannot thank you enough for joining us today. I just wanted to ask if there's anything else you would like to leave the listeners with now that we are here, the 2-year anniversary of the expanded invasion, the 10-year anniversary of Euromaidan, and the initial invasion back in 2014. Is there anything that we haven't talked about today, or any specific actions you would love listeners to take away from this conversation today?
Well, just don't take freedom for granted. Please make sure that this freedom is secured and protected to your children, to your tomorrow. And make sure that the international cooperation that we are all a part of really works for that values that we believe in. And I really think that everyone can make such a contribution to this future of tomorrow.
Amen to that.
Lisa, this was wonderful. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much.
And we
Thank
are
you.
thinking of you and all of your colleagues in Kyiv today.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Casey, I didn't know Lisa played the piano. Very excited to watch that video. I somehow missed that we played that at our forum last year.
It was an incredibly moving video. It's funny. I was in Kyiv a few months before Euromaidan broke out, and they have these pianos that are right in the middle of town. I had the opportunity to play one a little bit, but not nearly as well as Lisa.
You played the piano as well?
Yes, and again, it's not something I'm going to share with the world any time soon. But in keeping with musical themes, we have a great guest next week.
We have a lovely guest next week. Her name is Taneli Maseko.
Who's going to share her musical talents with us.
Yes, she's
much more.
A human rights campaigner in Swaziland, and her husband, Tulani Maseko, who was assassinated last year for his human rights work, she is the CEO of his foundation now. So we will talk with her next week, and she's a real delight. She's just an amazing person.
That's going to be a great conversation. Can't wait.
I look forward to it. The Human Rights Foundation is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that promotes and protects human rights globally with a focus on closed societies. We promote freedom where it's most at risk, in countries ruled by authoritarian regimes.